All right, welcome back to CHRTC 309. All right, so in this lecture, I will be looking at other theories of religion, sociological theories of religion. Now, what I will say is this is by no means like a complete list. I've tried to grab some of the big ones, the ones that tend to appear in the sociology of religion textbooks and literature. There are, of course, 100 million other things that people could, in fact, um, cite when it comes to all of these things. So, definitely, this is not an exhaustive list. These are some that I think kind of catch some of the kind of big thoughts that are out there, but certainly isn't a list of everything. And then, again, as it relates to young people, and I'll make some comments on the back end, there are definitely certain ideas that I find really interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about sacred umbrellas right at the end of the lecture. So, another big sociologist of religion from kind of the middle to late part of the 20th century is Thomas Luckman. So, Luckman is a contemporary of Berger's, worked with Berger on the social construction of reality. Berger's kind of magnum opus. His interest came to be in what's called invisible religion. And basically, he's a subjectivist, focused more on kind of epistemological sociology, how people know what they know, and basically, less interested, in some of, the operations of religion is how it kind of worked in people's lives. So his initial kind of interest was in that function. Um, and again, like Berger, following on Berger, he basically looks at people as making meaning through meaning systems and worldviews, these symbolic universes that we were talking about when we talked about Berger. And basically, he thinks that any kind of symbolic universe can be thought of as religious, because they get outside of the stream of someone's consciousness, right? They put them in connection with a larger story of the world. So here, like, one of the things that Luckman would think is that Marxism would broadly be a kind of religious system, right? And nihilism and atheism, they're all sort of religious systems in a sense. And basically religion in some form, whether it be, you know, kind of cults of leaders like you saw, say, in the Soviet Union, and you saw and still see in places like China and North Korea. It can be in specific or non-specific forms in all societies and basically in all socialized individuals, according to Luckman, right? Religion doesn't really ever go away. So one of the things that Luckman says is that obviously some religions are more developed than others, right? The religions that we're most familiar with, like if you think of the four largest world religions, right? Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, basically, they have kind of typically some kind of historical institutionalization of their symbolic universes, right? They have, institutions that go along with this. And now this can be a kind of, global levels, like if you think of something like the Roman Catholic Church, you're talking about an institutionalization of a symbolic universe, that basically encompasses, 1.3 billion people. But broadly speaking, it could be, less organized and more fractious kind of institutionalizations, whether it be, kind of fractious religions like Islam, which is much less unified than, Catholicism is. Protestantism, which is very fractious. But basically, the religions that we tend to know about have these historical institutionalized symbolic universes. They have clear doctrines, they have clear teachings, they have clear social organizations, and broadly speaking, they have specialists, right? They have priests, they have imams, they have pastors, they have monks, they have whatever. And basically, these institutional forms, right, the church and doctrines, the Catechism of the Catholic Church and canon law, Sharia law, they basically provide um, symbolic universes to society, right? They they give shape to those symbolic universes in kind of ritualized form. What Luckman thinks, though, is that in kind of late modernity, increasingly these forms are giving way to individualized forms of religion. So basically, like in the past, prior to modernity, in say Europe in the Middle Ages and, in other parts of the world prior to, really the interaction with Europe and the advent of modernity. Religion was basically the key structuring institution that basically defined a society's symbolic universe, right? It was the church, it was, the mosque, it was Islam, it was Christianity that structured the whole symbolic universe. Once modernity comes, modernity brings with it a sort of panoply of competing institutions, right? There, like I said, and ideologies, right? There's Marxism, there's nihilism, there's, socialism, um, libertarianism, all sorts of isms start to basically compete with Christianity, and all with kind of different institutional forms. And religious institutions, basically following kind of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, what we see is a sort of gradual separation from the lives of everyday people, right? Religious institutions, basically, which once were deeply preeminent, now are just one institution among many, and often institutions that people interact with far less than they do other institutions, right? Like, I mean, in the past, the church, say the Catholic Church, would have run the hospitals, it would have run the schools, it probably would have run whatever passed for a social welfare system in most places. As we get into modernity, the state starts to take on more and more of that role. And so religion, becomes something that is privatized. Um, it is kind of your own personal thing. It exists in the private sphere and increasingly struggles to find its place in the public sphere. Um, and one of the things, too, that really happens in modernity is sort of individualism takes hold. And with that, the shift from sort of concerns about the public sphere really shift into more individualistic ideas. And so, I mean, Philip Rieff writes about this. He wrote about this in the 1960s in a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, The Uses of Religion After Freud. It's a really interesting book. I mean, it's dry, but it is interesting. But basically, what kind of Rieff's thesis is, and Luckman, sort of picks up on this, is that the themes of, self-realization, autonomy, personal development become the pressing concerns in late modernity. And people are really concerned with themselves and bettering themselves. Now, religion can speak to all of these, Luckman thinks, but it's now no longer the only thing speaking to it. There are other sort of competing systems, right? Self-help, psychology, pop culture are all competing for, a seat at that table, right? So if you go to, say the Christianity section in chapters, or any other bookstore, what you'll find is basically, a component where Christianity has shifted almost into self-help, right? Where there are like, Christian-ish books, 5 biblical principles for financial success, or some such thing, right? Because religion is now competing with these other discourses, and often at a disadvantage, right? These things move with the market. They don't have any kind of constraint on what they can say, whereas, I mean, at least hopefully, religious texts have some kind of constraint on what they can say. But Luckman thinks, basically at the end of the day, religion is just not able to keep up. So what you get out of this, for Luckman, is basically what he calls invisible religion, right? Religion becomes ultimately kind of stripped of its institutional forms, right? It's not that people aren't religious anymore, and Luckman, like Berger and like Rodney Stark, are very kind of careful to say that it's not that those religious impulses essentially disappear. Um, but what you do get is, that broad agreed upon religious narrative vanishes, right? You can no longer really count on, say, the fact that everybody's going to know, say, the Christian story, right? The biblical narrative, or what any of that actually means. So what you get is people, stripped of a broadly socially accepted kind of symbolic universe, essentially have to start putting one together on their own. And religion is well, it offers these symbolic universes. It's just one discourse among many. And so people kind of tend to cobble together what they want. I mean, people are free to choose. Like, it's not to say religion has no role. People can continue to choose, say, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, psychoanalysis, Marxism, Buddhism, Shinto, Jainism, Judaism, any of the existing kind of developed and more fully realized religious systems are still available. But what Luckman thinks happens is more likely that people will cobble together from available discourses, a kind of religious identity or ideology. And this technically is called syncretism, which basically means just taking elements from one religion or another and kind of mashing them all together. Um, and obviously, this doesn't have any kind of institutional form because it's very much, everybody's individual kind of preference. And here, David Bentley Hart who's you read already, has a kind of pithy take on this. When he talks about, kind of modern takes on religion, he'll talk about how, people will have, be doing yoga in a room with a crucifix and a statue of the Buddha. Um, and basically, to the point, they might have some Reiki crystals and tarot cards stashed away in the cupboard, and maybe a Ouija board. And basically all of these things play a sort of part in their religious identity. Hart, thinks that religion of this kind in modernity, particularly, is hard to distinguish from interior decorating, right? People just kind of, and from consumerism, right? And I mean, just for a kind of interesting experiment, go on um, Amazon, right? And look for tarot cards, look for Buddha statues, look for Reiki crystals, Jesus posters. And what you'll see is that, consumerism in particular, and late kind of 20th century and early 21st century consumerism, has made it possible to basically sort of, from a consumerist point of view, consume religion as a sort of product, right? And to kind of cobble together, little bits of religious identity that really together have no institutional form because they don't actually make any sense together at all. But this religious individualism seems to be increasingly popular and seems to be kind of the overarching theme of late modernity in particular. All right, the first of four theories that I'm going to rattle through really quickly in terms of how religion operates kind of in late modernity. One of them is what's called sheltered enclave theory. And basically, sheltered enclave theory is just a way of trying to explain, away the secularization thesis, right? Realizing at some point that, religion didn't disappear by the end of the 20th century, and that it wasn't going to disappear for the foreseeable future. Sociologists of religion sort of start to look at, how we can explain why religion doesn't disappear, right? Okay, so sheltered enclave theory is one of these. And basically, what sheltered enclave theory says is that, religion, especially traditional and orthodox religions, survive and they do well when they are sheltered from the undermining effects of modernity. And basically, what this shares with secularization theory is the idea that basically religion can't thrive in the context of modernity, right? Under the onslaught of modernity, religion will tend to collapse and disappear. So basically, successful religions, religions that remain kind of active and vibrant, have to have low social engagement, right? They set themselves up away from society and keep themselves somewhat culturally isolated, right? They'll either consume no media or produce their own media. They're highly distinct, right? They are really at odds with the dominant culture, and they have really low levels of cultural engagement, right? So, depending on the group, right, you'll see, just a desire to stay away from culture. The Amish would be like this at an extreme level, right? The Amish who shun modern technology, right? They have no technology. They don't really interact with the outside world a lot in particularly meaningful ways, are a really good example of this. American fundamentalist Protestantism, a somewhat less extreme but still good example of this, right? Highly distinct from society on the whole, and tend to try and, say, produce their own television channels, movies, and all of these things in order to keep themselves sheltered from the effects of modernity. And so a lot of sociologists of religion will say that this is broadly how religion survives to the extent that it's able basically to keep itself away from modernity. And again, this always shares the assumption that eventually, as this slowly breaks down, as modernity impinges on more and more aspects of life, that these Orthodox religions will ultimately fade away. Another sociological theory as to why religion persists in modernity is called strictness theory. And basically, strictness theory suggests that, and this isn't true just for modernity, it's actually broadly true for all of history, but that the more strict a religion is, um, the better it's going to do broadly. Religions with really strict rules, for one thing, exclude everybody um, that has a non-orthodox position, right? They are very demanding in terms of belief. They demand high engagement, right? And here the Mormons are a superb example of a strict religion. Mormonism demands high engagement, right? In order to kind of be a Mormon, at the end of the day, you have to, go on a mission once you turn 18 if you're male. For girls, you're expected, to get married quite early, typically. Um, you're expected to attend church every week for, it used to be about 3 hours. I think they've cut that down in the last year to about an hour and a half. You are expected to give 10% of your before tax income, right, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You're expected to participate in all sorts of social events. They have interesting networks within Mormonism where people kind of go and check on each other, right? Like you as an elder in the church, and everyone's an elder, always makes me laugh when like an 18-year-old kid, um, who's a Latter-day Saint, comes to the door knocking, and he looks like he just got out of diapers to me because I'm getting old. Um, or older, and he's got a tag that says Elder Bird, and my laugh is always like, where is younger bird? But right, like everybody is, all the elders are assigned two or three other kind of couples in the church that they're expected to kind of check up on and see how they're doing, check on how their families are going and all of this stuff. A very strict religion. Now Mormons tend to have really great transmission rates from generation to generation. They tend to do especially well over time in terms of transmitting the faith. So in that sense, Mormonism is a really interesting example. There are very few free riders in strict religions, right? Basically, free riders are a sort of problem for any corporate organization where you have, a number of people who, might want to join an organization for the benefits. But at the end of the day, they contribute very little. They suck up all the benefits and they contribute almost nothing. This is a chronic problem, say, for new religious movements and unions in particular, right? Where like new religious movements, you'll often, and say the Moonies or the Unification Church that sort of came over from Korea and set up shop on the west coast of the United States, really kind of good example of this. What you get with say the Moonies is they would set up these houses and sort of let people who are interested in the religion come and stay. And some people would convert, but there is a not insignificant number of people who joined the Unification Church and kind of didn't go out and help recruit new members. They didn't really contribute much monetarily to the corporate pot. They were basically just there for a free place to sleep, and because being there offered them access to a bunch of nice people, especially women, that they could have sex with. So free riders, basically attach themselves to almost any organization. But stricter religions tend to do really well in terms of they kick out free riders. They don't allow free riders. So all of this kind of ends up with strict religions offering people more, right? The people who are in a strict religion often will find that it has a lot of benefits, right? That some of the social benefits, the economic benefits, the social networking benefits, social and cultural capital benefits, all accrue at very high rates in very strict religions. And this is why broadly, like if you look at Mormons, poverty among Mormons is not unheard of, but it's greatly lessened. Simply because they really do band together, and being a Mormon in a sense has a lot of potential social benefits, and the whole community will be there to help you out if you are struggling. So social mobility amongst Mormons is extremely good. Like if you look at their kind of ability to move up the class structure in the United States in particular, very, very impressive for Mormons because it's a strict religion. All right, so status discontent theory basically suggests that one of the reasons that religious groups have continued to, proliferate in late modernity is that basically, when they're faced with declines or threatened declines in social status or numbers or position in society, what religions tend to do that are successful is retrench into strong identities, right? So they will, work actively to strengthen their members' identities and fight against external threats. Um, you know, Basically, the perception that we are threatened leads to a concerted effort to strengthen the whole community. And basically, those that manage to survive and do well do so because they've reacted well to external threats, right? They manage the external threat and they survive. Specific examples of this, are a little bit less apparent. But if you look at, say, the Methodist Church today, or say Catholicism in England, prior to really the 1970s. Catholicism still thrived in England, even though it was technically illegal and it came with a lot of penalties. Broadly speaking, because they managed to really inculcate a deep identity into people and manage the external threats that Anglicanism and the British Crown sort of posed to Catholicism in England. Now, once that external threat is potentially removed, a lot of things can go wrong. Like once that external threat and the mobilization that comes with it is removed, you can often see, broad declines in religiosity. And here you might think of like the Catholic Church in Poland. Catholicism became a sort of rallying point during, both Nazism and the Cold War and domination by communism and the Soviet Union in particular in Poland. Retrenching into kind of Catholic identity gave Poles a common, way of dealing with the threat of atheist communism and the wiping out of their religion and, Polish culture in the hands of Soviet Russian culture. Once that threat ended, though, what we've seen is a pretty precipitous decline in church attendance and Catholic identity in Poland. So, status discontent theory actually does account for this because that external threat, once it's removed, the impetus for that community to hold together disappears as well. So the last theory here in the theory section is what's called the subcultural theory of religious strength. And this theory comes courtesy of Christian Smith, a professor who was at UNC Chapel Hill when he wrote the book that it's in, American Evangelicalism, Embattled and Thriving, but today is at University of Notre Dame in Illinois. And basically what Smith is, I think, one of the most interesting sociologists around today. His range of interest is huge, and the diversity of his kind of work is I think, really interesting. And behind Rodney Stark, I think, probably one of the more influential and interesting sociologists of religion out there today. Okay, so what does subcultural theory of religious strength say? Basically, Smith makes the case that religious groups thrive to the degree they're able to harness kind of four factors. And this is in modernity, right? Where broadly they're faced with, secularism kind of knocking at the door. Basically, distinction, right? They need to be highly distinct, right? They need to have their own kind of culture that sets them off of the rest of society. But they also need to be engaged with it, right? They can't just sit back and, he contrasts here American fundamentalism, which has tended to segment itself off, with American evangelicalism, which has tended to broadly try and reach out to the culture, right? Has been wanting to evangelize the culture. And here, you can think of the examples of people like Billy Graham. And Graham is the founder, really, or one of the key founders of, or I guess, the public face. There were lots of people involved of the neo-evangelical movement in the United States. What we today think of as American evangelicalism is really kind of a new articulation of evangelicalism, and Graham was like the spokesperson for it. And what Graham would do, right, is that he would go around and he would hold these revivals, right, or these ministries where he would preach in these giant arenas and invite people to give their lives to Jesus. And they founded magazines like Christianity Today, and organizations like Focus on the Family and the Family Research Council, and all of these things basically to engage with the culture in kind of meaningful ways, and think tanks and all of these things. But the idea is, right, you're not just sitting back. There's a sense of mission to the culture that you remain highly engaged. You need tension with the culture, though, right? If you don't have tension with the culture, according to Smith, broadly speaking, what ends up happening is you end up dissolving into the culture at the end of the day. And so for Smith, looking at American evangelicalism, what he'll suggest is one of the reasons that American evangelicalism goes from it doesn't exist in the 1950s to, with Graham and a whole bunch of others, kind of at the head, it grows into basically, and it's a little hard to say the exact numbers because who's an evangelical and who's not is always a bone of contention in sociology of religion, and it's not a term that's especially well defined, but it becomes basically the single largest religious group in the United States, with membership, about 20 to 28% of the population, tops out at about 35 in the 1990s. And it does this, partially, in deep tension with the culture, a culture that's actually undergoing, a transition from, the sort of conservative and broadly Christian culture of the 1950s and the American past into the sort of more postmodern culture, that starts in the 1960s. But that tension, that constant tension with the culture, of sexual libertinism, of individuality and individualism and sort of moral relativism, um, ultimately, broadly drives the growth of the evangelical movement, which always holds itself in tension, and a conflict, right? Always in conflict with the dominant social order in some way. You need that conflict to sort of make the whole thing work, right? Again, one of the things that tends to happen, and going back in a sense to thoughts we had on when we were talking about market theories, religions that don't have conflict and don't have tension with society tend to dissolve into that society, right? They become too comfortable. They become kind of lethargic and lazy. They lose their sense of purpose. And so, in order for religions to do well, they need basically to be in conflict all the time, and they need to perceive some kind of threat. Now, one of the things that Smith will be very kind of clear about is that one of the things you're not likely to see is, something like, a mass reconversion to American evangelicalism. One of the things that sort of allows these groups to do well is that they're subcultures, right? They are broadly speaking, they form their own little kind of subculture within society that is kind of like the society, but has, these distinctive, say, Christian or Muslim or whatever elements. They're not likely to take over, right? They only work as subcultures. Once they become the dominant culture, we shift into a completely different mode, and a lot of the strength will honestly get sapped out of them. So if you look at, the United States, for instance, one of the things that's happened in the United States is mainline Protestantism, those older Protestant traditions like Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Methodism, Congregationalism, have sort of faded away. They basically lost a lot of their strength as they've kind of come in line with the dominant culture, right? They've just sort of dissolved, and people have stopped attending, potentially because, like, why bother? Like, what am I getting here that I couldn't get, say, on Meet the Press on Sunday morning instead? So the kind of, you have to have a subculture, with satisfying morally orienting collective identities. And it has to provide meaning and belonging, right? This quote that I'm reading from Smith, right? People have to feel like they belong. Yeah, they'll be relatively stronger to the extent that they possess and employ cultural tools to create both that distinction and a significant form of engagement and tension with relevant outgroups. But they can't quite become countercultures, right? Because if you become countercultural, then you're too at odds with the society, and then things go kind of wrong, and society kind of doesn't accept you at all. Okay, the other thing that Smith says, and I think this is really interesting, is he'll sort of admit that this idea that Berger has, that the sacred canopy of the West, which was Christianity, has disappeared, right? But he thinks that so a canopy, right, is like a covering over a large area. What he'll say, though, is that religious subcultures, and American evangelicalism is a good example of this, have been successful in creating what he calls sacred umbrellas, right? So it's not a sacred canopy in that it doesn't cover the whole of society, but it's like a little covering, like an umbrella that covers just that group, right? And it does the same thing as a sacred canopy. It gives them meaning. It gives them a kind of orienting moral sense of the world. It tells them, the story of who they are and where they fit into the cosmos, just for their little group, not for the whole society, just for their little group. But, it does provide that kind of sheltered meaning that people need, essentially to do well and to survive.
So one of the reasons I find this concept of sacred umbrellas, I found a picture of the most sacred looking umbrella that I could for the slide. The reason that I find this concept particularly interesting is honestly that it is honestly a question, and it's whether certain religious cultures are better than others at creating sort of sacred spaces or kind of protected ideological, intellectual, and spiritual areas for their young people, right? Whether there are certain groups that are good at building sacred umbrellas, and others that are less good. Now, I think there's a certain degree of evidence that suggests that certain groups, uh, conservative Protestants, or what you might call evangelicals, Muslims, Hindus, and other, Sikhs and other minority religions in, say, Canada and the US, have done a fairly good job of creating these sort of sacred umbrellas, right? Basically, these kind of ideological, worldview kind of spaces where they pass on their religious beliefs to their children and sort of are shielded against the outside kind of secular culture in major ways. Now, never perfect, right? There's obviously going to be, people who step outside of the sacred umbrella who are not kind of protected by the sacred umbrella, and become secular. But when we look at the religious landscape, I think there's a lot of interesting things to say, particularly about, which groups have done a better job. And I mean, if we're going to, I'll give you a little spoiler. Catholics, Roman Catholics, and mainline Protestants, and we'll define these terms in a little bit, seem to have not done a very good job of creating these sort of sacred umbrellas for their young people, because they lose a lot of their young people, right? Retention is pretty low for them. But again, we'll talk about that when we look at the religious landscape and sort of try to figure out what's going on a little bit with young people. So sacred umbrellas, I think, for me, it's not an idea that necessarily has had a lot of currency in the literature. But for me, I think it's a really interesting one that I always kind of has had purchase in my mind, saying, okay, which groups are good at creating these kind of sacred umbrellas? And definitely from my sort of anecdotal experience, interacting with students and around Edmonton, you definitely see, and I think here especially of Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, really kind of different approaches, but actually really well kind of structured approaches for passing on culture and faith to their young people, that seem to be resistant to an extent, always to an extent, to kind of secularization and wider secular forces. Okay, so this is probably a good place to kind of leave this off. And then in the next set of lectures, we're going to be talking about different theories of secularization.